back to the AI Accelerator Podcast, where we get practical about AI. Real use cases, real results, real takeaways. My guest tonight is Erick Watson, founder of SproutVest, a fractional chief product officer who helps AI companies turn frontier research into revenue. His career spans Google, Microsoft, and Protocol Labs, including running a $150 million Microsoft business in Beijing. And tonight he joins us from China itself. Erick, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into it, Erick. As I mentioned prior to the podcast, my son's done a lot of international travel, including going to China. I haven't been to China yet, but you're joining us tonight from Xi'an, China, and your career spans, all around the world. But you've done a lot of work in China, whether it's with Google, Microsoft, Protocol Labs. Right? Give us a short version. How does a linguistics major from LSU end up running a Microsoft business in Beijing, building products on 2 continents? Like, how does that happen?
That's a long and complicated story, but I guess the short version is that while at school, I fell into computer science somewhat by accident. I was running a computer lab as a student, and so when I got my first job out of school, the recruiter, I was all excited because I had been to China for a year and I spoke the language reasonably well. And I was like, I'm going to combine this Chinese and this, linguistics, and I'm going to go get a job working for Boeing building airplanes or something like that. And the recruiter was like, no, tell me more about the computers that you worked with. And this was at the dawn of probably client server computing. And so I was like, those computers, they're so boring. Why would you want to talk about them? And yet one thing led to another, and I ended up working at Microsoft, and that was sort of where my career took off. So it was a little bit by accident, but it's been a very fortuitous accident, and my family and I are very grateful for the privileges that we've enjoyed as a result. So it was not something you could plan for, I suppose.
No, not at all, especially with today's day and age. So we're going to get into a little bit more with AI and with everything that's happening. But tell us about what SproutVest does. What does a fractional chief product officer do inside an AI company? What does it look like? Just explain for people who aren't as familiar with that landscape. What is it like?
Yeah, absolutely. So most startups are highly constrained, right? They're constrained by talent, by time, money, and technology. And so a lot of times they need help in a very specific way, but they can't just hire a new employee to help them do whatever it is they need to accomplish. And so my specialty is on product market fit, which is one of the more challenging problems that startups face when they're launching, when they're bootstrapping. And so rather than hiring a full-time product manager to try to sort that out for them, I can come in on a part-time basis and help frame things up so that they can basically figure out how to move forward successfully without burdening themselves by hiring a full-time person. And so that's been kind of my specialty niche. I'll be teaching a class on product market fit for the Watson Institute, which is a firm that actually does training for entrepreneurs who focus on social benefits situations. And so that'll be very exciting this fall. I'll link to more of that on my site. But to make a long story short, my job is to come in and help founders, funds, and product managers figure out what they've got and how quickly they can commercialize it so that we can ensure their success.
That's fascinating. And focusing more on the smaller to maybe low mid-market sizes, I'm guessing, just from a fractional perspective, correct?
That's right. There's actually a lot of firms there's a term they call the messy middle, which refers to people that have already got their seed and Series A rounds, and so they've got a little bit of money, and they know they're basically on a pretty good trajectory, but there's a lot of difficulty in figuring out how to bootstrap from a small, tight-knit team to something that can scale. And making that pivot is very challenging for the majority of startups, really. And it's not until the startup has made such a pivot and really begun to scale that you start to hear about them in the public news and in the public eye. So that's what I try to focus on, because I think that's where most of the action is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
For sure.
Yeah, certainly. That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about one of the hottest topics in the news today is the USAI, there's China AI, there's all sorts of things happening culturally and globally around the hottest change to ever hit the planet, basically. So you lived the headlines before they were headlines, Erick, from your exposure there in China, from where you sit in China. What is, for those of us who are not in China, what does everyday AI adoption look like on the ground there in businesses and daily life? Like, what would surprise an American executive the most from your perspective?
The one thing I think that's really stands out as compared to what we hear and see in the West is the level of optimism that people have around AI, which is somewhat counterintuitive, because I think when you read the headlines in the Western press, a lot of people are concerned about things like job loss and will AI take over? Will AI destroy us? Could it be the end of the world? We have a lot of these kinds of sensationalistic headlines that are designed to sell journalistic articles in newspapers. In China, people are much more optimistic. And so the country has passed new laws recently. For example, they're forbidding companies who replace labor with automation to fire the individuals who get replaced. So in other words, if you're the CEO of a Chinese company and you just figured out a way to automate, half of your staff out of a job, now your job is to figure out how to re-employ them in some other capacity, right? You can't just make them go away and say, oh, I have less employees, now I'm more profitable, right? And so that's become a matter of national policy. Another national policy that I found really fascinating was they've made illegal the creation and promulgation of AI companions. So we read a lot in the Western press about how teenagers and youth are going through, puberty and different changes, and they're struggling with their identity, or even just mental health issues more generally. And people turn to AI sometimes to have someone to speak to, because we have such a crisis of loneliness in the West. And in the East, they've basically laid down the law and said, nope, we are not going to allow people to solve their emotional and mental problems with AI. They have to talk to other people. That's the kind of people that's kind of creatures that we are as humans, right? And so it doesn't make sense to create an artifice where someone is establishing a relationship with a non-human AI, right? And so these are things that I think Westerners would find very surprising and very odd, but also I find them, very inducing of hope, right? It tells me that at least somebody on the planet knows what's going on with AI, and they're starting to put in the guardrails in that will hopefully point us in the right direction as a species and as a society.
Yeah, they both are music to my ears. Like, I love hearing that, and I wish that we had more of a transparent view to how AI is being viewed and practiced across the world. It's a very U.S. centric view, obviously, here, and a lot of us who are speaking to other agendas, such as like what you're talking about, is don't lay people off, but empower the people, right? You should be able to scale up your company faster, right? That type of dialogue is still very controversial compared to the American press.
Yeah, and one quick third example that I think would also people would find surprising. I don't know if you recall when OpenClaw first came out, and it enabled an AI agent to actually take action in the world and manipulate other programs. OpenClaw was a huge sensation here in China, and in fact, you can find it in the most mundane of places. For example, there's actually like an OpenClaw logo at the local coffee shop that I go to. So here's a situation where a barista is literally using OpenClaw to find a way to make money online or to improve his or her life. I've also found it at government offices, right? The other day I was at a notary office trying to get a document notarized, and on the notary's screen was this big screensaver with OpenClaw running. And I'm like, okay, here's a government employee that's actually using OpenClaw during the day to try to figure something out. I don't know exactly what they were using it for, but it really took off dramatically. And I don't think you see that level of embrace of the technology, or that level of experimentation in general society, right? I think we as technologists, or as people who are in the business, so to speak, are always playing with it and learning more new things. But to see that happen across such a broad cross-section of society with millions of people in it is not only fascinating, but really speaks to the power of the technology and how it can transform opportunity for us moving forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. That sort of segues to the next question I have for you, because OpenClaw. So a lot of the big AI stories come and go here in the U.S. I mean, OpenClaw was huge for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But it just comes and goes. And speaking of something that's really hot right now in the U.S. is the Chinese open models like DeepSeek, Qwen, are just taking off like crazy. They're handling a huge share of AI workloads globally. People in the U.S., people everywhere. Largely because they're dramatically cheaper, but they're also highly capable. today.
Mhm.
And do you think this is mostly a price story? Is there something deeper maybe happening with how China is approaching AI? It's more open
Mhm.
versus closed model like Frontier Labs. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts in general about that topic?
Yeah, I think the open weight models speak to a very deep-rooted value in Chinese society, which is, and I believe it was Neil Gaiman, or I forget, one of the British sci-fi authors once penned an article in Wired magazine, and he was talking about, at the time, the hype was how Chinese were stealing intellectual property from the West, and this has always been a very hot topic. Western companies hate the fact that Chinese will come in and appropriate some piece of technology and use it to their own ends without paying for it, of course. And so they're like, they thought this was criminal and everybody was losing their minds. And Neil Gaiman said something to the effect of, Chinese don't view software any differently than they view a wok or a hammer or a ruler. It's like the most basic technology. They're ruthlessly pragmatic people, right? And so every technology that is introduced into the world, the first question they ask is, what can I do with this, and how useful is it, and how useful can I make it to the broadest cross section of society? I don't care about paying people for licenses. I'm not going to pay America a lot of money for discovering, something that essentially became a physical fact in the world. I'm gonna use it to improve society, because so much of China's history has been punctuated by internal strife and fighting against Mother Nature, fighting against one another, right? And so one of their greatest cultural values is stability, societal stability. And so, whereas if we in the West tend to tear at each other and go to battle with one another over the meaning of AI and how it's going to be integrated into our society, here the first question they ask is, what can I do that's going to benefit the most people the fastest? Oh, I know. I'm going to make it open weight so that anybody can do whatever they want with it, right? And it's the most utilitarian way you could possibly approach it. It also does have a more sinister aspect if you want to think of it from a geopolitical perspective, because obviously, why would I pay $1 trillion for Anthropic or OpenAI when I can get it for free from China? And you see that happening now, right? It's almost a reverse IP appropriation. Now American companies are using these open weight models from China because they're so much cheaper than what's on offer from the commercial entities that we have today. And so it raises a bigger societal question, which is, what is the purpose of the corporation and in our society, and how much money is okay for us to gather from our population and repurpose for reinvest in research, let's say, for example, versus how much of that do we have to give back? And we already see some inkling of this from people like Elon Musk and other pundits who talk about, we're going to have universal basic income in the United States. And I think Elon Musk said something just the other day, like, in 5 years, we won't have to save for retirement anymore because AI is going to make so much money for the world that we'll just redistribute the wealth to everybody. And those are all really nice ideas, but how is the rubber going to meet the road, so to speak, and where are we actually going to distribute that money? I think China's well ahead of the United States in terms of thinking about these problems and trying to develop a policy approach to address it in that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's so much to unpack there, Eric. I want to get into the workforce side of it, the people side of it. I love how you talk
Absolutely.
about how the Chinese culture is very pragmatic, and how we're getting into some of these topics that a lot of Americans don't understand about the culture there. So a lot of our listeners lead mid-sized American companies, and a question they're always asking is, should the China versus U.S. race, which I think is a U.S. invented topic, really change anything about how they adopt AI this year? In other words, you're a mid-sized C-suite executive at an American company. How should they be adopting AI this year? Is it a distraction to think about this topic we're talking about with this open versus closed tier model, or is it more about like just being highly pragmatic, like you're saying, and just taking the best of the best, getting your workforce up to speed, accelerating your companies? What are your thoughts on that? Just the pragmatic side of AI application.
For sure. I think there's two decisions you have to make right up front, and that is this if I'm the leader of a mid-sized company and I'm developing an AI system to solve some problem that I have, is that solution going to be unique to my business? Is it something that's going to give me a competitive lever in the marketplace? And if the answer is yes, then my recommendation would be to develop that as close to the vest as you could. And that typically means taking an open weight model off the shelf and purposing it for your special use case. If the answer is no, and it's a more general problem that a lot of companies have that's not really going to make you any more competitive in your market, then fine, use a Claude or use an OpenAI or use a ChatGPT or whatever, because that's something that is not going to necessarily have a competitive impact on your business, and therefore it's easy to use one of the cloud models. And so I think the open closed model debate is a little bit of a smokescreen for what's important to business owners and stakeholders, because they really need to think about, am I just making a really mundane problem go away, or am I doing something transformative to my business that is unique to my business, right? And I'll give you a great example. I just talked to a client here in Xi'an, a mid-sized company that's in the home services business. Home services in China is different than home services in the United States. It's basically defined as infant care, elder care, and maid services. Essentially, it's all the services that you would imagine walking into somebody's home with and saying, "You two middle-aged people go to work, and I'll take care of the kids and the grandparents while you're gone." Right? Like that's kind of the shape of home care services in China. And they let go of their entire development staff because they were able to rewrite a CRM from scratch. But they thought that it was very unique to their use case, because they're like, hey, the core of our business is about scheduling and making sure that we have the right person in the right place at the right time. And so we have this kind of CRM scheduling calendaring system that we think is proprietary to us and that what makes us special, and that's why they built it in-house. And so that's an example of a mid-market business making a decision about how they're going to compete and where AI fits into their model. And so I hope that illustrates how to approach the decision when you think about your business.
Yes, they used an open weight model there, to be clear. Yeah,
they did, and they brought it in house, and they literally had some developers write it all up for them, and then they cut those guys loose, and they said, okay, we don't need you anymore. This is done. We'll call you when we need you if something breaks, right? Like that's kind of how that went. And so as a result, they don't pay recurring licensing fees. They don't have a full-time IT staff. They've reduced their cost of operation dramatically, and they have something sort of baked into their model that they think gives them a competitive advantage.
That's fantastic. That's very good insight. And I'm glad you give the practical example because that's what a lot of mid-sized company executives are thinking about right now. Like, what do we bring in house? In the U.S., actually, they're just like, how do we bring AI in? Like, what do we do? They're not even at this level of conversation yet. It's more of like, how do we start? How do we get started and start to get some momentum behind us? So let's shift a little bit. Your specialty is in turning research grade technology into products people use and pay for, right? And so to explore that a little bit more, where do you see AI companies adopting AI most often failing on that journey from demo to revenue, like from that initial path?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion and FUD around where AI is best applied and how to measure the business results of its application. And I'll give you a specific example. When ChatGPT first came out, we saw a lot of people using it to produce written documents, right? They were like, hey, I used to have to write this from scratch, and now I can just tell the AI what I want. It'll spit out a document. It'll save me tons of time, and I won't have to worry about it anymore. But nobody actually stopped and said, well, how much is it worth to have this document? And how often do we need to update it? And why do we have it in the first place, right? And so the absence of asking those more fundamental questions about the role of that document in their business process is a prime example of how people have sort of misused or misallocated their excitement about AI, right? Because they don't always think through the business problem. They're typically thinking through it from a more myopic point of view, which is, hey, I'm sitting here at my desk. I'm trying to get through my 8-hour day. How's AI going to help me go faster? Oh, I know it. I can give it this really bum assignment that I really don't like and would rather it do for me than I do for myself, right? And there's no business analysis that says, oh, the reason why we hired you to write these documents is blah, blah, blah. And so, the amount of money the company makes as a result of your efforts is blah, blah, blah. And so taking that step back and doing that sort of assessment and saying, where can AI help? How can we measure its impact? How can we verify that we got what we paid for? And I think what happens is a lot of times people give relatively low cost, low value assignments to AI, and then when they get the results back, they're like, whoa, I paid $1 million for all these tokens, and I only got $100,000 worth of documents out of it. AI sucks, like it doesn't work. And it's sort of like if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so you have to, I think, take that step back, put a business analysis lens on it, and say, what is it that this company is doing, or what is it that this department or even this particular person is doing, and how can we apply AI in a way that elevates that role and makes it more efficient, more effective, and hopefully along the way also empowers that individual to have more impact for our business. And if the answer is, well, this was a bad idea to begin with, and we just happened to put a person on it because we didn't know what else to do, then that's a candidate for reconstituting that role in some way. But if it's a core to your business, like another good example is field support operations, right? Like I hear from the equivalent of like plumbers and electricians here in China. Their biggest challenges are always getting the right people and pieces in the right place at the right time. And you could generalize that to more of a supply chain problem, right? You could say, hey, this is true of all supply chains, is getting the right thing in the right place at the right time. So how do we apply AI in a way that allows us to optimize that? And where are inputs coming from? And how should we change our procurement processes in order to support what we want to accomplish in the marketplace? And these are kind of the bigger picture questions that I think a lot of companies fail to think about before they jump into the AI pool and then begin to make an assessment and go, oh, this is kind of funky technology and it doesn't make sense to me. It kind of reminds me of earlier technology waves where people adopt technology. They don't really know what it's good for until they make a few mistakes and stub their toe on it a couple of times. Mm-hmm. And then they start to figure it out, and then they go, oh, I know where this can be applied to the greatest effect, right? And I feel like we're in those early days with AI right now where people are stubbing their toe on it and haven't quite internalized how it can best be applied to their business case.
Yeah, very true. Very true. It's right on the mark, Eric. For what do you think with the U.S. and China, different cultures, different parts of the earth here? What's the most overhyped storyline in the U.S. China AI conversation right now? What's the most and maybe what's the most underreported one that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think in the U.S. we sensationalize we attribute too much intention to Chinese malice. I'll call it, right. Like if you read a U.S. article, they're convinced that the Chinese Communist Party is out to get the United States, right, and they make it this black and white, us versus them kind of very very polarizing sort of coverage. If you look at it from inside of China has a lot of disparate forces pulling and pushing it, and their goal is just to really calm everything down and keep things stable, right? And as a result of that, they do some things that can be viewed as threatening to the West, right? But they do it in their own self-interest. They're not doing it because I don't believe they're doing it because they literally are trying to mess with us in the United States, right? It's just a consequence of what they're doing that we perceive as being infringing upon some of our freedoms and some of our rights, right? And so I think if people took a more circumspect analysis, a deeper analysis of why the Chinese people do what they do and why the Chinese government does what it does, they would come to a different set of conclusions, right? It doesn't mean that we're not in competition with China. We are in many domains. However, there is a logic to what they're doing that does make a lot of sense and is very well thought out. It's not they're not trying to inflame our differences, if that makes sense. And so it just sometimes that happens as a result of what they're doing. And so I think if one takes a more measured view of China and the world, it would lead to more opportunities for collaboration and cross-pollination rather than this kind of us versus them very polarizing mentality. And if that were to happen, then I think the thing that we could learn from the Chinese is about scaling things, right? Like I had a conversation with a friend of mine in healthcare the other day, and I said, I feel much better. I feel much more well taken care of in the Chinese healthcare system than I do in the United States healthcare system. It costs me a ton less. I get PhD level doctors, and I don't have to fill out a bunch of forms. It's amazing, right? Like, I wish we could do this in the United States, right? And he's like, oh my God, don't get me started, right? Like, he was all excited about that. And so I do think there's lessons we can learn from one another if we approach it with an open mind.
Yeah, love that approach. Love that approach, Eric. Last question for tonight is one I usually like to wrap up with is, or for, I should say tonight for me, but this morning for you. For the leader of a mid-sized company who's listening, what's the one practical thing that they should be thinking about this week, doing this week to make sure their team, their company, their organization is on the right side of this shift we're talking about?
Yeah. I would, if I were leading a mid-sized company and thinking about AI in this context, I would say choose a business process, maybe not your most important business process, but one that introduces cost, or one that has really been bugging you, that you would like to see improved in some way, and just isolate that process and then try to deconstruct it with AI in mind, right? And see how you might approach that process in a different fashion. And we use procurement and supply chain examples. We could use healthcare examples. We could use field support examples. But just, I would say, start small and pick a process that if you break it, it's not going to be the end of the world, but it's been really kind of bugging you and causing some friction, and you want that friction to go away. And then reinvent it from the ground up. See how AI could help you potentially readdress that process. Because I've seen Chinese businesses address some very human processes that we think of as being unautomatable, because they tend to require so much human discretion, and they have so much variability to them, that I think on a first pass, an American analyst would say, oh, we're not going to touch that one because there's just too many moving parts, right? And yet some small Chinese businesses have accomplished this in their milieu. And so I think it's definitely within the realm of the possible. And so pick a process, deconstruct it, apply some AI tooling, measure the results, right? Make sure you understand what improvement you're going after in order to get that feedback correct. And then once you learn how to do that in the context of your company, it's just a matter of knocking down the next process and spreading the wealth until you finally get AI automation in all the places where it can really help your business.
I love that. It's a great approach, Eric. Thank you so much for your time, your insights, all your collective intelligence that you applied here to this conversation. It really helps us all move forward. I really appreciate your time today, Eric.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's been my pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity.